Engedi Ministries presents Living Water. Welcome to another in the Living Water Bible Study broadcast. I am your host, Danny Hale. Your speaker today is Dr. David Lawrence. On behalf of the entire ministry staff, we want to thank you for taking time to be with us today. Today we continue a series by Dr. Lawrence we have entitled, Why Should I Believe? This series is designed to help us understand that our faith is not without a firm foundation, for we have evidence from many sources that support our beliefs. In previous lessons in this series, we have dealt with basic reasons why we should believe in God, in His revelation through the Bible, and last week we began to see what evidence we could find in history to support the Christian faith. This is a two-part lesson entitled History Confirms the Bible, and today we will hear part 2. David?
Thank you, Danny, and welcome to the Living Water broadcast. We are looking at reasons to believe the Bible, and we are looking at reasons to believe the Bible based on history, on the fact that history at many points is going to confirm the Bible. Last time we looked at the very beginning of history at Sumer, and now we come up to Genesis 6 and the account of the flood. And some people say, well, now that's ridiculous to think that there could be a flood over all of the world that would have destroyed everything and only 8 people would have survived. However, it's interesting that not only do we find the record of the flood in the Bible, but we find it in nearly every civilization and many times traditions handed down in cultures that do not have written history. I mentioned at the close of last week's program a book by a man named Ray Winkle, a scholar who a number of years ago produced an excellent classic book on the flood in which he gives an account of all these different civilizations, such as the Greeks, such as the Romans, such as the American Indians, such as the Babylonians, the Indians, the Chinese, who have an account of the flood. And it is very interesting that the original language, the original characters of the Chinese, of which there are a few hundred, and that was expanded into many thousands of characters later, but there are just a few hundred basic pictographs of the Chinese language, Chinese written language. They will have a reflection in those original characters of the accounts in Genesis, which leads many people to believe that the so-called culture heroes who came to China and brought the Chinese culture to them at the beginning of the Chinese civilization were in fact from Mesopotamia. But one of the very interesting things is that the symbol that is used in Chinese writing to depict a flood shows a boat with 8 people on it. And so the evidence for a flood is in the literature and in the history of many, many different civilizations. In addition, there is considerable archaeological evidence that would point toward a universal flood because there is a flood layer that can be found anywhere in the world. And there are evidences of sea creatures, if you go down far enough into the earth, even in places that are now deserts, even in places that are inland. And that would suggest the presence of water there at some time. The Sumerians have a list of kings before the flood, which shows that they had a remembrance that was carried down to them in some way of a civilization that was antediluvian, that was before the flood. Gilgamesh, that is featured in the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, is the 5th king after the flood, and he tells the story of encountering a man named Utnapishtim, who in fact is a Noah figure, who tells him of how he and 8 members of his family survived the flood. Admittedly, there is some polytheism in the account that we would expect to find from the Sumerians and the Babylonians who picked up the Gilgamesh account, but it is remarkably similar to the biblical account. And there have been various sightings, supposedly, of the ark. Now, none of this is too definite, but there are many different books. I have 3 different books in my library written by people who have researched the ark and who have some documentation through interviews with people who have people in their family way back who actually saw the ark, or their supposedly pictures were taken of it. But at least there is enough documentation, enough evidence that one would say that there's something up there on Mount Ararat. Apparently it's split into two parts, but there's something there. Now, my faith is not dependent upon the finding and the verification of there being the ark on Mount Ararat. But it is interesting, and it's just one more bit of evidence to add to the accumulation of evidence that we have. Also, the flood provides an explanation for geographic features, such as the Grand Canyon, for instance, the Great Mountains, and the various phenomena that the evolutionists say would have required millions and millions and millions of years in a slow development to occur. The force of water is so tremendous that given the unleashing of this great quantity of water and the power of that water, it would explain for an instantaneous rearranging of the whole landscape of the world, for canyons to be carved out of rock, for mountains to rise up, for things to be totally removed and changed. Now, some people, some Christians, do not accept the catastrophic explanation for these phenomena, but it still is a viable alternative explanation for the long periods required by the evolutionary hypothesis. And also, Scripture says that there was no rain before the flood. It was only after the flood, and many scientists have postulated the idea of what they call the canopy theory, and that is that there were ice crystals that covered over the earth, surrounded the earth, and allowed the light of the sun to be diffused, which would explain for tropical vegetation in places that are now Arctic, frozen. For instance, mammoths have been discovered in the Arctic, frozen in ice, but when their stomachs were opened up, they found vegetation that was tropical in nature. This animal had just been quick frozen, as though all of a sudden, catastrophically, there was a major change in climate. And of course, if the canopy theory is true and the light of the sun was diffused, it would also account for the elimination of a lot of the cosmic rays that would come through that perhaps would bring disease, such as cancer. And that, in turn, might account for the extreme longevity of man before the flood, that longevity gradually being lost after the flood. You see, everything would make sense if the flood were true, and would make sense without the necessity of these extremely long periods of time that evolution requires. So the point is that when we believe the Bible account, it leads to a more complete and, I would think, in many ways a more adequate explanation of natural phenomena than does the evolutionary theory. For instance, even the division of the continents. We can look at the continents and say, well, they all fitted together and there was this one landmass at one time, but given the upheaval of the flood, then that would be the time when the continents were divided, as Genesis 10 says, and where we find the continents drifting apart and people developing in very different areas. We come to chapter 10, and I mentioned chapter 10, which picks up the account after the flood and after the covenant that God made with Noah. And it's called the Table of Nations because there we find the major racial divisions from the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Generally, the Japhethites went north, become the Caucasian people. The Hamitic people went south. They become the darker-skinned people. The Semitic people are the ancestors of both the Arabs and the Hebrew people. Now, we won't go through all of the Table of Nations, but it's interesting that in Genesis 10 there's a specific mention of Cush, who was a son of Ham. And we know that the Cushites developed in Africa south of Egypt and became a very strong civilization. At one time, as Egypt declined, they took over Egypt and ruled as one of the dynasties of Egypt. It also mentions Erech, which was, we know, one of the major Sumerian cities. And it mentions Akkad. We know the Akkadians, who were Semitic in origin, will conquer the Sumerian civilization about 2400, rule for about 50 years, and then will merge with the Sumerians and will become somewhat the Sumerian-Akkadian culture that goes on to greatness in the years after 2350 up to 1900 BC. The Akkadians spoke a language known as Eastern Hebrew. The particular city of Akkad has not yet been discovered. That's something for archaeologists to do in the future. And Genesis 10 also mentions Assyria and its capital Nineveh. Assyria is a very good example of the depravity of man, because when we go to the British Museum and we see the artifacts that are on display in the British Museum, if you compare Sumer with Assyria, you're going to see that the Sumerians had such beautiful things, well-balanced society, evident from musical instruments, from different kinds of letters, different works of art. But when you come to the Assyrians, you see it's all a preoccupation with war and violence. And the Assyrian capital was Nineveh, which was built, according to the record, by Nimrod. And Nimrod was a great builder of cities. And the Assyrians will settle at Nineveh and make it their capital. For many years, it was thought that Nineveh was a myth, that it did not exist, because there was no record of Nineveh to be found anywhere in history, in literature, outside of the Bible itself. And of course, the Bible does mention Nineveh many times. However, in 1829, a British archaeologist by the name of Sir Austen Henry Layard discovered the city of Nineveh, excavated the city, and found huge palaces there of Assyrian kings, such as the Palace of Sargon and the Palace of Sennacherib. And again, the British Museum will display many of the findings of Layard in Nineveh. As a matter of fact, whole wall panels and sculptures have been transported there. Also mentioned are the Casluhites, from whom came the Philistines, and the Capharites, whom we think are the ancestors of the Minoans, who shaped the Greek civilization and hence all of Western civilization. And the Canaanites are mentioned, as well as the Amorites, who, of course, are the Babylonians, following the Sumerian civilization with their great king Hammurabi and his great law code. Also mentioned in Genesis 10 are the Hittites. And once again, we encounter a situation where skeptics claimed, well, there are no Hittites. The Hittites is just another creation of the legendary, mythological ideas of the Bible, proving that the Bible is false. But the Hittites now are well known to be a real civilization because they were discovered in 1875. The capital of the Hittites, Hattusas, was discovered at the site of Boghaskoy in Turkey. And now if you will go to the Museum of Anatolian Civilization in Ankara, Turkey, you'll find all kinds of artifacts that were discovered at Hattusas. And the discovery of the Hittite civilization unlocked many mysteries. For instance, the Battle of Kadesh that we know about from 1295 during the time of the great Egyptian pharaoh king Ramses II was against the Hittites. And Hittite documents indicate that it may well have been a victory for the Hittites, if not a draw between the Hittites and the Egyptians. And now we know that the Hittites were expanding out of Anatolia, out of Turkey, moving around into the Levant, down into the area of Palestine, creating this great empire at the same time that Ramses was creating a great empire, moving out of Egypt up also into Syria and Palestine, and of course the two eventually met in 1295. Well, that's extremely important, extremely interesting. We know about the Hittites now. We know about the great king Suppilulimus. We know about the great king Hattusil. We know that the Hittites were powerful from 1400 to around 1200 BC. We know that from archaeology, but the Bible speaks of Hittites many, many times. And so again, archaeology has confirmed the biblical account. In Genesis 11, we read about the Tower of Babel, the time when languages were confused because men were seeking to build a monument to reach heaven and giving no glory to God. And God will not be robbed of His glory. We know that the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat, and as I mentioned last time, the ziggurats were built originally by the Sumerians. They were pyramidal-shaped towers that went up in step form with a platform on the top where there would be a temple. And the Babylonians continued this ziggurat building, and it would, of course, inspire the Egyptians, who would take it up as the pyramids that would become tombs for their kings. And not only do we know about the ziggurats, but the Bible talking about at one time everyone spoke the same language leads us to point out that there are many scholars who study language, many philologists, who do believe that there was a common original language. The Germans call it Ursprache, an original basic tongue that God gave to man. Philologists such as Otto Jespersen, who said we really have to come back to believing what the Bible said, that there was one original language. Alfredo Trombeti of Rome has written a book called The Unity of the Origin of Languages. Another scholar by the name of Max Miller has also come to this conclusion. And when you study the language families, you can see the commonality of so many, many words. Now, there are a few languages, like the Turkish language and the Magyar language, and some of these that are still quite difficult to fit in and to say where do they come from, but there may come at some time some evidence that will indeed tie them in with existing language families. People have said, how did Abraham travel to Canaan? How is it possible that he could go all that distance from Sumer, from Ur, to Canaan? And records have been discovered from archaeology showing accounts of extremely long distances that were covered in travel. We know that in the ancient world, in that very ancient world, it was not uncommon to travel long distances. So once again, archaeology confirms the biblical account. Sodom and Gomorrah we read about in the 19th chapter of the book of Genesis, destroyed by God because of their sin. And we look at Sodom and Gomorrah now, and it is a desolate place, but archaeologists have discovered evidence of civilization living there, of it being a very densely populated area up to about that period of time, around 2000 BC, when there was a break in the civilization. And that would justify what Lot decided when he parted from Abraham and took his family and his flocks and his herds to Sodom because it was a well-watered plain. Abraham's practice of bargaining with Ephraim the Hittite. Remember when Sarah died and he purchased the cave of Machpelah from Ephraim and made a bargain with him. And Ephraim says, I'll just give it to you. And he says, no, I don't want to take it. I want to pay for it. And yes, I would give it to you even though it is worth 400 shekels. Oh, well, I will pay you this amount for it. Well, this kind of bargaining where the owner of the property is going to say, I'll give it to you, and the person who would be the buyer is going to say, well, no, I will not take it for free, and then he will name the value of it and still say, yet I would give it to you even though it's worth it. This has been proven from contracts and from letters and from documents that have been discovered in the ancient world. And so we know that what Abraham was doing was consistent with the pattern of living at the time. That's an example of how archaeology illuminates the biblical record. We also know so much more now about covenants. The Bible says that God deals with us covenantally. He deals with us by covenants, that He made a covenant with Adam, that He made a covenant with Noah, that He made a covenant with Abraham, He made a covenant with Moses, He made a covenant with David, and He makes a covenant with us through Jesus Christ. God deals covenantally with His people. And we know now because just recently so many Lord-vassal covenants have been found from the Near East. They always begin with the Lord identifying Himself and who He is, and then promising something to His vassal, setting forth then the requirements of His vassal, and providing some type of assurance that He will deliver what He has promised. We know about that now, and that the discovery of these covenants from the ancient world has shed considerable light upon the covenants of the Bible. We also know about the legal significance of possessing family idols. Do you remember when Rachel and Jacob left and went back to their homeland? And remember that Laban, Rachel's brother, was very upset because Rachel had stolen his family gods, or teraphim. And he was extremely distressed by that. And she kept them. We know now that the one who possessed the family teraphim, the family gods, had legal rights in court to the property. And remember how that Esau sold his birthright to his brother Jacob. From the Nuzai tablets, we can read about selling one's birthright. And remember how he also took the blessing away from his brother. Jacob took it away from Esau and obtained the blessing from his father, Isaac. And we know now that once that blessing was given, it had legal standing in court. It was irrevocable. So, of course, Esau was upset. Again, we have light being shed. The account is illuminated. When we come down to the time of Joseph, and you remember that Joseph was sold as a slave by his brothers and was taken into Egypt. Now, after that, Joseph rose to great prominence in Egypt and became second only to the king, to Pharaoh. The skeptics have said that would never happen. No Hebrew would be allowed that position of prominence in Egypt. Well, yes, he would. Because at the time of Joseph, Egypt had been conquered by the Hyksos. And guess what? The Hyksos were Semitic people, meaning they were related to the Hebrews. And during that Hyksos rule, which would be about the time that Joseph was living there, around 1700 to around 1500 BC, they would of course been favorable to people that were related to them. And that would account for the Egyptian king allowing Joseph to be in command. And then remember that the Hyksos kings allowed Jacob and his family to come into Egypt, about 75 of them, and then to become very great and prominent. And then a king arose who knew not Joseph. That would reflect the time that the native Egyptians came back to power around 1500, and we call that the New Kingdom. And remember that the Hebrews left Egypt under Moses. They were first oppressed, and then God raised up Moses to bring them out in the great Exodus. We find in the Cairo Museum, in Cairo, Egypt, a stele by Merneptah, one of the kings, who brags about the fact that he'd driven the Hebrews out. Now, Egyptian kings never would record anything derogatory to themselves, so we would expect this Egyptian king to turn it around and give it the most favorable construction and to say he drove them out rather than the fact that they actually went contrary to his wishes. If Merneptah indeed was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, then his father Ramses would be the Pharaoh of the oppression, and that would make very good sense because the Hebrews were forced to build the treasure cities of Ramses, so says the text. And then under Joshua they took the promised land, fulfilling the promise that God had made to Abraham. The Rosh Shamra tablets tell us how evil the Canaanites were and would explain why God would say that the Canaanites were to be killed. Later on, David, the great King David, became a ruler over a vast amount of territory. And when we read what the Bible says about how David controlled everything all the way up into Mesopotamia, the skeptics again have said, this can't be true. How could a Hebrew king possibly control that much territory? Once again, history has the answer for us. When we look at what is going on at the time of David, which is about the year 1000, we see a most amazing thing. By the year 1000, the great powers that would otherwise be rivals to Israel have all disappeared. And somewhat mysteriously, I might add. For a believer, that's no problem. We can say that's the providence of God at work. For instance, in Mesopotamia, there was no great power. Babylon was in power from about 1900 BC after the fall of Sumer until around 1600 BC. And then there were several groups, none of them very powerful, none of them nearly as powerful as Babylon or Sumer, such as the Kassites and the Mitanni and the Hurani, and of course there were the Hittites up in Anatolia in Turkey. But by 1100, all of those powers had disappeared. Around 1200, the Hittites disappeared. They came to an end. Also, over in the Aegean Sea area, there had been the great Minoan civilization, and there was the great Mycenaean Greek civilization. Both of them had disappeared, and Greece went into what was known as the Dark Ages by that time. In the western part of Anatolia was the great Trojan civilization, but in 1185 they were defeated by the Greeks, and so they were gone. And Egypt had become a very weak power by then. Now, isn't that interesting? There were no rivals, there were no competitors. Only the Phoenicians were strong, but the Phoenicians at that time were friendly toward David and toward the Hebrews. And so that would explain, there was nobody to stop David, no great power to stop him, though he did have to wage war against several enemies, as particularly the Philistines. But yet he was able to do this. And it is as though God simply cleared out all the rivals to enable him to fulfill his great promises to his people. And then because of sin, because of idolatry and rebellion, then they lost that greatness, as we know. The Bible tells us Solomon constructed great cities, and he had stables, and he had commerce, and he had trade, and he had a navy. And we have evidence of this. For instance, at Megiddo, there has been excavation done by the University of Chicago, and scholars there revealed stables that dated from Solomon's time. The Bible said he had whole cities given over to the stabling of horses in 1 Kings 9:19, and these stables accommodated 300 to 500 horses. The Bible said he had a seaport at Ezion-Geber on the eastern arm of the Red Sea. The archaeologist Nelson Gluck found a town there at that very spot with smelting furnaces that would be used by Solomon's workmen to produce the copper. And that site lay in the path of a prevailing north wind that would be needed to produce the forced draft for the furnaces. Ezion-Geber was, in one respect, the Pittsburgh of Palestine, as well as its most important point. And then remember, under Solomon's reign, that he had a visit from that famous Queen of Sheba, who came because of his great wisdom and said the half has not yet been told. We now know that Sheba was a country that is in the area of what is now Yemen, and it was a very highly advanced civilization in Arabia at the time, and very involved in trade. And so the importance of Solomon has been illustrated and has been vindicated by archaeology and by history. Ahab's ivory palace in Samaria was discovered by Clarence Fisher. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king that's now in the British Museum, shows King Jehu of Israel offering tribute to the Assyrian king. It was found by Layard. It's the only portrayal of a Hebrew king. And then Hezekiah, who reigned in Judah. The record in the Bible in 2 Kings 20 and 2 Chronicles 32 talks about his building a conduit, and we can see that today. It's 1,800 feet long and about 6 feet high. And inscriptions tell how the stone diggers began at either end and joined in the middle. Also, the Taylor cylinder tells us about Sennacherib's invasion, and we're going to talk about that in our next broadcast because that is so interesting. We don't have time for it today. All of these things are evidences from history and from archaeology that the Bible indeed is true. Please join us in our next broadcast as we'll continue to look at reasons to believe that the Bible is true, reasons from history, reasons from archaeology, and we'll come to reasons from prophecy.
Thank you, David. These lessons, as with all of our materials at Engedi, are designed to help you in your own personal Bible study. I hope you are finding these basic lessons on Christian apologetics helpful. Remember, if you would like a tape of this lesson or tapes of the entire series, you may receive it by calling the ministry office at 1-877-936-9334. Again, that's 1-877-936-9334. That's a toll-free number. Or write to the ministry office at Engedi Ministries, that's E-N-G-E-D-I Ministries, 165 Blair Road, Laverne, Tennessee 37086. Also by going to the internet at www.engedi.org, that's E-N-G-E-D-I.org, you may view all of the Bible study materials we have available. Again, until next time, may God bless you and keep you.